Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show Freedom Cole. Freedom is an author, teacher, and all-around specialist in Vedic Astrology, which is what he joins us today to discuss, along with chakras, the Indian experience of magic, the antiquity of astrology, and how to save farms from bushfires using dragons. Enjoy. Freedom, thank you very much for your time.
Yes.
Nice one, nice one. Well, I'm looking forward to this, I think, because you're a first-time guest, so you get the traditional first-time question. Freedom, were you a weird kid?
You know, the other night before I listened to a few of her recordings, and I got that was the standard question. And I started to think about the question, and I was like, I guess I was a weird kid. And I never thought I was a weird kid because I never looked from the outside in. I was always looking, people always looked at me like I was different and such, but I never thought to use the word weird.
Yeah, so a couple of people have kind of picked up on it. It's almost like a Jedi mind trick, right? Because especially in the early days of podcasting, people were a bit nervous talking about things that even if they're experts in it, those days are long past. The show started, I think, in 2015, right? So it's a bit past that, and we're all very used to talking on the internet now, right? So
Yes.
It's sort of a little trick of getting people used to a discussion, but it also is a seemingly bigger question than it seems, especially if you look at the etymology of the word weird, which is why I deliberately use the term. So what do you think then, looking outside in, how were you?
Well, looking outside in, what I get from the question is kind of, how were you different than everybody else when you were little, when you were small as a child? That's what I'm getting from the question. And I was a more quiet kid, a more sensitive kid. In before age 12, standard life, I grew up in a very rural area, farming folk and very just common people around me, nothing very different. My mother was into the yoga scene, and she was studying yoga and reading yoga books. And so I was being introduced to this Indian world. As different, I spent a lot of time by myself, taking walks in the woods. There was a lot of nature where I lived. I had a lot of small mystical experiences at that time.
Nature-based ones or what? Because usually the first time I put the question together, I'm like, gosh, I hope I talk to like alien abductees or something, which I have in fact done since that. But the mystical experience of posthumous visitations, that kind of thing.
No, just, you're walking through the woods and then everything becomes very sharp and bright and beautiful, and a moment of awe of experiencing what's around you and feelings of unity and such.
And did your mom, did you dabble in any yoga, or was that profoundly uncool because one of your parents was doing it?
No, I was into it from the beginning. So from my pre-teen time period, we were doing yoga and only drinking lukewarm water because that's what yoga said was best, and things of that nature.
Yeah, I remember. That's funny. I remember dabbling in Falun Dafa at university in Sydney, because it's got a very large Chinese population and a lot of Chinese refugees and things. And that was the same. It's like you would cold water messes with your energy center, your sort of Falun. Yep. So there you go. Do you still
So-
keep that up? I have my water reservoir, which is triple charcoal distilled on the edge of the bench, where it is certainly not like every time I drink it, I kind of think, yeah, I have been told that this is the way we're supposed to to be drinking.
No, I think I'm even, because that was just my mother dabbled. I've jumped into the ocean. And so there was that, and just that time alone, around age 12, started to have memories from my previous lives, and it was really strange because the memories that I had did not fit into anything relative to the reality that I lived in. And so it made me feel very strange. But I was already, I guess, a weird kid. I was the kid in high school who was teaching other kids meditation and saying, oh, let's sit around and meditate. And everybody else wanted to get drunk. And I wanted to like show people, look how cool, look what you can do with your mind. And I did experiment in the more psychedelic realm of drugs, but alcohol and was never really. It didn't expand the mind in the same way. So I was a big fan of things that made the mind bigger, things that allowed me to work with what this brain consciousness was doing and the realms it could be created and altered with the alteration of mind.
So what were some of the, this is interesting. So what were some of the past life memories, and were you, not like full details, but, and were you aware that that's what they were at the time, around that sort of 12, 13 age?
Yeah, I was aware of what they were because they were clear enough. And some of them were even very clear to the point, and I don't talk too much about it, but I was like, oh yeah, I was this person, and I did a little research. I was like, oh, this, I went and actually looked up the books that I had written in that previous life, and it was a very strange experience because I'm looking at the books, that some of these texts that I'd written, and I was trying to read them, and I would read a page, and it would be like I hadn't read anything. I'd read the page again, and there was some block that wouldn't let that connection be there, even though the memories were present.
Yeah. Here's an interesting one, because I have a similar thing, not that I remember, although this is actually true, but didn't happen when I was a kid. My past life memories that showed up at the time, I could tell that they were different from dreams because they were sense memories. So one of them was a sort of, as far as I can tell, late era Egyptian tambouriness rather than priestess in an Isis temple. And I can distinctly remember the warmth of the stonework getting up in the morning, because it was still warm from the day before. And so I remember thinking that at the time. And it was a morning thing, because I think I bathed in a nilometer, which is not what they're used for, but I have a memory of getting up, stones being warm, and like dipping in a nilometer. But those are sense memories in the same way. I've just got back from a walking holiday in upstate for me, and we were in the ocean and so on. So I can remember the feel of water from yesterday now. And so I was at around the same age where this kind of, and I started dabbling in magic, and that fragments of that life popped up, but they're not memories in the sort of, they're not memories, almost like the wrong word. Do you know what I mean? Like I remembered senses of it.
They're shadows of memories.
Yeah.
And for me, I was at that age, I was dabbling with, because my mother was doing yoga and meditation, and so I'm dabbling in yoga and meditation, and there's something different when a child meditates. There's a little bit of a less density that you're fighting against, and so they were like shadows of memories, and they were images and things that were just coming into my mind, and I'm like, what is this? Like this, it just was so incongruent with the realm that I had lived in.
Yeah, fair enough. Nice. And so was that, carry on.
Yeah. And so those memories kind of led me down a path of reading and researching and digging for for a certain type of knowledge. And and I ended up dabbling in the concept of chakras and energies, the energy system inside of the body. I met at 17 a Buddhist who taught me how to meditate a lot more, uh, much, in a much deeper way than I had been previously. And
Is this a wandering monk? Were you still in your sort of Superman origin story, rural beginnings then? Or
I would at that, as soon as I was old enough to drive, I would take my time and on weekends go to Philadelphia.
Yeah, fair enough.
And so I was in not in the countryside for that one.
Nice one.
And so let's see where to go from there. And learning that stuff and studying deeper every text on yoga and the energy body and what's happening inside, things that could help me understand these meditation experiences and help me understand these psychedelic experiences. I read and explored, and eventually I was 19 when I met my first yoga guru, who was, not just somebody local who's studying yoga, but somebody who had done years and had powers and had ability to teach a higher level of understanding of technique and concepts of that nature.
Nice. So, because this is a clunky way of asking it, but it was going to be one of the questions. Did the India come first, or did the Vedic astrology come first? And it seems like the India came first. Do you know what I mean?
Yoga came first.
Yeah. Well, because I've been thinking about this of late. What is your? Because this could be a show in and of itself, and maybe it will be one day. What is your take on chakras?
My take on chakras. So the thing is, there's new age chakras and then there's traditional chakras. And, the new age has taken a lot of Indian concepts and painted it in very pretty pictures. The new age concept is they're a rainbow colored, there's 7 and it's very new agey. In the deeper level, there are centers of energy in the body. There are certain feelings and emotions that are stuck in certain parts of our body. There are ways that when we bring attention, awareness, and prana into certain aspects of our body, it activates certain elements of our being, certain elements of consciousness. And are they these colors of the rainbow? If we look at the different traditions, it's not very traditional to have this rainbow colors. In the more practical texts, it's more a matter of taking these centers that tend to hold a certain level of consciousness and bringing colors, images, and creating an imaginal realm where you are harnessing them through imagery to actually utilize them. Not that the imagery itself actually exists in the chakra itself.
I like it. Yeah. Because where I've sort of, because obviously I'm not going to disagree with you on any of that, but I've been thinking about what you just called the New Age chakra as the sort of Western framework that was built more or less in the 19th century and had embellishments in the 20th of the sort of 7 chakra system. And it seems to me, and you just sort of nailed it there at the end, where there is in fact an authentic praxis of working with, let's just call them energy centers, or as you say, states of consciousness that map to a body in some way, of cultivating and activating capacities associated with it. And it's almost like the New Age chakras, rather than being the chakras, are a practice that works because chakras exist. Does that follow? You know what I mean?
It's a practice that works, but it's a New Age, it's a very light, fluffy understanding. Instead of getting to the integrated level of understanding that image, sound can activate and alter us. Like for the heart chakra, if somebody says this is the sound of it, well, we can actually use 3 or 4 different sounds depending what we want to do with the energy in the heart area. And if we visualize it as green, it's giving us a certain impact, but we could also visualize it as red or blue and get another impact. So the new age system on a certain level limits the
Yeah.
potential that is possible to utilize the system itself.
Yeah, totally. Totally. It's just that I always try to look to find ways of how something might work, I guess.
Yes.
And it's sort of a practice built on that. I am sort of seeing it in my head as like a tree diagram where there's sort of one individual line going the whole way along a sort of tree chart, and that is the 7 chakra new age system. And that's kind of where I'm seeing it in my head. It's one, and the limit is the right thing there. It's like this. If you think it's only that, it's almost a sequencing. If you think that's where chakras are, some things will happen, but they're limiting. Where if you can kind of step back and go, that's one expression, and a maybe not a best in class expression of how one can be with a framework like chakras. It's sort of I do this thing where I try to make things, even just as an intellectual exercise, work. And I'm trying to find a way of going like, well, because it's not that this is wrong, but the take that like, the Western chakra system is wrong or it's fake.
Simplified. It's just oversimplified.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm trying to find a way of making it certainly not equally valid, but to slot it into a framework that allows it to be.
And oversimplifying things allows people that don't have a deeper understanding and context to be able to get connected to it and to have an experience that they would not be able to otherwise.
Yeah,
so
I like
there's a wonderful element to it. And
nice.
For the deeper level of work and healing, it's important to not be limited by it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. All right, back to 19-year-old freedom and the yogi.
But yeah, I mean, it's fun. Chakras were really big for me at that time period. But then, I'm stepping into systems of 5 chakras, 7 chakras, 9 chakras. There's 12 chakra systems, and yeah. But I had my first real yoga guru, and his name was Baba Hari Das. And he has all kinds of, he was a very right here, right now individual, and at the same time, very transcendental individual. And he introduced me to Ayurveda. And I went to Western school for psychology, got my BA, and I went to school for Ayurveda at the same time. And thinking about your weird question, I was like, was I weird? And then I'm thinking about, I chose at one point, I was like, I'm not going to wear shoes for a year. That's what I told myself. And for 1 year, I was 100% barefoot in university.
Where were you living? Where did you go to university?
That was UMass Amherst.
Doesn't it snow there?
Yes. It would snow and be.
So you didn't go to Hawaii. You went to shoeless in Hawaii is a different prospect.
I was in the snow barefoot, but to me it was a way to train the mind and create that mind over matter, and so I would do things like that, and people I think definitely thought it was weird. And I know for a few periods of time I did a month where I didn't talk. No word out of my mouth. If I needed to do something, I would write it down. And so, yeah, a lot of practices that people that don't understand would consider weird.
Did you have a little sign with you that said, I have like a month-long vow of silence or something?
Sometimes if people met me the first time while I was on silence, they thought I was deaf or something. I once even tried sign language, and I was like, no, I can hear you and talk. I'm just not talking. And then they think you're even weirder. But yeah.
Did any of that coincide with being shoeless in the snow? So if someone met you for the first time, it's like, oh, this is Freedom. He just walked in the snow and he's not going to talk to you.
Those happen separately, but
Good.
some of the things I did were concurrent.
Yeah,
But I did a lot of yogic practices with the intention of altering the mind, empowering the mind, making the mind stronger. A lot of times when people say yoga, they think of these body postures and asana. And traditional yoga has so many other elements to it that is much more of a mind training system than a body fitness system.
Yeah, I like that.
But so that first yoga guru, he got me into Ayurvedic medicine. And as I got into Ayurvedic medicine, that eventually led to the doorway of Vedic astrology. Because as I was studying Ayurveda, there was a medical astrology class. And when I experienced that, I was swallowed alive. And in the Vedic world, we personify the sciences, and so if we personify the science of Jyotish, as it's called, uh, it came for me. She came and took me, and I was subsumed in
I
her.
love it. Yeah. Was it kind of like turning the page in the handouts or something and getting to medical astrology and it being like, oh yes, I mean, because typically when people find that, or when it finds them, there is that kind of moment of, oh, I'm definitely going to be about this. Was there a particular
I
thing that
was
happened?
I was actually, it was a little more unconscious. I saw it. I was like, wow, this is incredible. I have to know this. I can't do Ayurveda without this. Western doctors have X-rays and MRIs, and I have this. And they can see inside of a brain. I can see what is the reason a person had this, what happened in their life that is caused this problem. How can I rectify the karma that's creating this suffering? And so I was just there, and I still thought I was doing Ayurveda and yoga. And then I ended up in India working in a clinic, in an Ayurvedic clinic. And I
Was
asked
that part of the training, or because I have a why go to India question? And before we get to it, because I grew up in
yes.
a regional context as well, there's something. There are places I've been, like the Amazon, where when I was in them, I felt tremendous gratitude at being there. But I also sort of never really thought it would happen to me. Like I never really thought I would go to the Amazon or wherever. Did you, growing up in a rural context, obviously being a, you know, Indianophile or Vedophile or whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
It must have crossed your mind, but was it always kind of like the goal or the dream? It's like, I'm going to live in India for a bit at some stage.
No, not at all. I never even thought about it. Was just, there was the internship after I finished my Ayurvedic training. And of course I was going to go work in a clinic and get better at my Ayurveda. And then it took about a month to adjust to India, but it felt very at home. And all these various images that had made me feel so weird when I was younger, it all made sense. I was like, oh, they do this here. Oh, that's normal. Oh, I'd go to the temples, and these images that had been there in these visions it was not abnormal. It was common. And I quickly, I'm not that good with verbal language, but I very quickly was able to pick up the body language and the body gestures, and entered I adapted to India very quickly.
Nice.
It was like home. It was, I can't imagine not living there, because I spent the next decade and a half living there about half time. And I I mean, even this year with COVID, India's been closed, and I haven't got my few months there, and it really feels so yeah. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but the density of the Western consciousness compared to the world of what we would call in the West the magical world that they live inside of. As you live in the density of here, you start to take on some of the density when you're living there, and really not living there as a tourist, but living there as just living. You get to merge with this more magical realm that the world is less dense.
Yeah. I understand completely. Believe me. Fascinating. So, there's a mutual friend of ours, Austin, has suggested some trajectories in which this goes. But firstly, so a decade and a half so far of living in India, half time ish. Whereabouts principally?
Well, finishing up that first. So I went to the clinic to do more Ayurveda, and I asked the doctor who was running this program. I said, can I have because he would send me for a month to go work with an herbalist, and then he'd send me a month to go work in a place in a pharmacy where they were making stuff. And so I was working in his clinic, but also studying under different doctors. And I said, can you find a medical astrologer that I can work with? And a few weeks went by, and then he said, we'll have a conference. And he invited a bunch of astrologers, medical astrologers from Bombay and Pune and these other places. And when the list came out for what the conference was going to be, I was on it as one of the lecturers. And I was like, wait a minute, like, and he called me an astrologer. And I was like, I thought I was just, learning herbal medicine, Ayurveda, and it hit me that that's all I talked about. Everybody considered me an astrologer. And I'd read every single person in the clinic's chart, everybody that worked there. They asked me for advice. And it kind of took me by surprise on a certain level.
So you didn't realize you'd become an astrologer. That's pretty good.
No, yeah.
We were joking about this before we hit record, right?
Yeah.
The question you probably get asked quite a bit, and it's difficult to, it changes each time you get asked it in a way. But what is Vedic astrology then? Like, how do we're at that point in the conversation where we have to pose that question.
So the term Vedic astrology is actually only been used since the 80s, putting the word Vedic in front. Some people have used the term Indian astrology. Some people have used the term Hindu astrology. All of them have a good reason to use that term. All of them have a reason that doesn't fully work. The term used in India is Jyotish, and Jyotish means that which is of the light. And so it's relative to the lights of the sky. And it has a much broader meaning to it than the term astrology does in the West. For people that do yoga, I say it's like if we translate it yoga as Indian exercise, it really wouldn't
get it. Yeah. Okay, that's a great
the whole system. It wouldn't bring in the breathing practices and the diet and the meditative practices. And if we translate it as Indian exercise. So when we translate it as astrology, we actually lose so much of the system of what Jyotish is. And I should say traditional Jyotish, because there are in the West people who were Western astrologers who decided to learn some Indian techniques, and then they're just only doing astrology and they're calling it Vedic astrology, even though they're not in the whole traditional realm. But when I'm classically trained, and I make my own calendar every year. It's available on one of my websites for free download. It's only in the Pacific time zone. But, I make my own calendars determining the local holidays. I'm trained in counseling. I'm trained in and I'm trained in how to guide a person with what rituals to do in their life, what deities to be working with. Um, yes, and uh, I'd say a third of my clientele are more than a third, but about a third are Indians calling me from India, and another part are Indians that live in the West, and then I have the Westerners that I work with. Um, but it becomes an integral element of life. A more traditional Indian wouldn't go to a psychologist if they were having an issue in their marriage or an issue with their mind. They go to a Jyotish, and so it's a very encompassing realm.
Yeah, I have a question. I love the idea to call it Vedic astrology is the comparison being it's calling yoga Indian exercise. I think that's perfect, right? Because I have another question, which we sort of touched on, like, which I'm going to have to modify now, but are you even doing Vedic astrology if you're not doing magic? And I think, again, that there's sort of three clunky terms in that sentence, but what you just said about it being integral is, I think, important, and people miss this.
No, it's completely integral, and there are a few schools of Jyotish that aren't heavily based in what we would in English translate into magic, um, but it is not traditional. And when we look at the classical texts, you cannot separate the two in from the Vedic perspective.
Yeah, I like it. So,
And so, and just to go there a little bit deeper, this term magic, uh, what it means in the West, what the term magic means in India. If you said, "Are you doing magic?" to a standard Indian priest or a traditional Jyotish in India, and they'd say no. And the reason they'd say no is when we use the term magic over there, they think of somebody pulling a rabbit out of a hat. They use this term magic in a very westernized concept of tricks. And so the term magic, if you're talking to a more traditional Indian, doesn't actually translate over correctly. And so what would work? It's in that realm because it's the conceptual framework of what magic is so ingrained into the society. There's so many different schools and traditions. If we look at what the Vedics are doing that we would call magic, it's very different than what the Tantrics are doing and calling magic, which is very different than, there's many different realms of what it's called and how we use intention, elements, tools to alter and change the direction of reality.
yeah, it also occurs to me it doesn't work that well backwards either, which is why it's clunky. So,
It's a very clunky translation issue.
totally right. And even in the 21st century, what we would consider magic isn't something that Agrippa would have considered magic, and he wrote books on it, right? So the inclusion, um, the fact that there are planetary or celestial associations and governances associated with plants that we would use with herb lore and so on. Even because we have a word like magic, we have to have words like herbalism and so on. But if you live in a magical universe, or if you participate in a living cosmos, the word magic can't capture that. So it's actually, magic doesn't port well into India, but it also doesn't sit right. It only sits right in the 21st century West because we've had this sort of 300-year Cartesian head trauma, right? So it's kind of funny. It's like, are you living in a universe that's alive or not? Because you wouldn't, for something like astrology to work, and it works in a living universe where it has governances and associations that you are participating in and subject to, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this, it's either, you can't be half pregnant, like it's either relational or not.
Like your traditional Indian in a village could take the roots from the ashwagandha plant and say certain mantras over that, get it blessed, wear it around their arm to protect themselves by from some pains that they were having that are being caused by Saturn, and they would not call that magic. They would just
Exactly.
call that medicine. That's
Exactly.
just to them. There's a certain normative nature of that.
All right. So next, this is having just said all that, this is coming back to quote unquote Vedic astrology. And it's a how old is it question with a follow-up question. Which are the oldest parts?
Which are the oldest
Parts of something like Vedic astrology?
You get a lot of opinions there. And there's the philological, the philology opinion. And then there's looking at the archaeology. There's so many different opinions. To me, one of the issues when we're talking about Vedic astrology is we're talking about a colonized nation that was colonized by the British, ruled by the British. And when they tried to rebel, the British implemented a program of trying to belittle everything Indian. And it was, from Oxford itself, the research was in a way that was working to show that everything was from Greece, everything originated in the West, nothing was originally theirs. And remnants of that still exist in a lot of the modern research. So if we look at a lot of modern historical stuff, there's a distortion to it. Myself, looking at the Indian astrological tradition, when we talk about Vedic culture existed in Iran, what is now Iran, Afghanistan, what is Pakistan, northern India, all the way over to Burma. Vedic culture existed in all those realms. At the time of the Sumerian thousands of years of observation, Vedic culture was completely interacting with Sumerian culture. It wasn't like it was way over there and Sumerian culture was way over in a different space. And the astrological practitioners of Sumeria and Babylonia regularly were having migrations into India. And one of the most famous Vedic astrologers, and to call him Vedic becomes because some people call him an Iranian astrologer. And yet, from my perspective, I call him Vedic because he's talking about certain Vedic deities, and he's the foundation of the system that we use. But his name is Varaha Mihira, and Mihira is showing that he was coming. It's an Iranian name. He was established in a particular part of India, and his family was established there for an extended time period. The tradition that I come from is from Odisha in eastern India. And there is a traditional sun temple. And the main deity in the temple, who the British took and is in a museum in London, he's not in the temple in India. And so, just keeping what the British did to India in mind, the sun god who was in the temple wears boots. And people don't wear boots in that part of India. And the research shows that they are boots that are worn in a more what we now call Iran, Afghanistan area. So we can see that there was even the migration of these Iranian priests there. And we use the term magi, which I think is where the term magic is coming from. And in India, these magi were called Magha Brahmana. And they have been in India since as long as there's been writing. So when we say how old are parts of it, to me, India has within it the living tradition of what was within the Babylonian astrologers of ancient.
I love it. And I would also add that I kick the door down and say 20,000 years before that as well. Just because where we have just because we can, and I think it's too conservative anyway, but just because we can approximately date like the writing down of the Rig Veda, they're oral hymns. So what do you want to like? And so they just add an extra, oh, I don't know, maybe they invented it 2 centuries before. And I'm like, really? Really? that's
Yeah.
that's what especially as you say,
There's
you
no,
can do the
understanding of the complexity
no.
of what's in those texts.
and that's all, and this is kind of like the how old is it thing, because if you look at the deliberate number of bricks for certain altars and so on, you're dealing with Vedic astrological numbers, you're dealing with processional numbers that are baked into this cosmovision that you've been articulating, right? So if they're there at the beginning and they're oral, we see them turning from an oral tradition into a text-based one at a certain time point. But by the time they're doing it, same thing with Sumer, it's not like they learned astrology, all those beings that they have the stories of that are there at the very, very beginning of the archaeological level. What did you think? They just invented them the week before, right? So when you're looking at the kind of, and I know this is a problematic term, but when you're looking at something like Eurasia, you can say 20,000 years with a straight face now, because it's not even an absence of evidence challenge. It's that we've had to learn new ways of doing comparison that allow for those kind of time depths, because we've historically, as you just mentioned, like Indology was immensely racist. It was racist at its beginning in like the 18th century with the Germans and the British, where
It's still
they're like,
racist right
yeah,
now.
but it
It's
sort of
still racist.
reversed the racism. So it's like India invented everything in the 18th century, but not the brown ones, like the lighter skin ones. And then you get into the British period, it's like India invented nothing. And look, so that yes, they maybe wrote these texts down that they maybe invented a century or so before. And you go, we have had to relearn how to do comparison to find that story, which is why I asked you the question, I think.
Yeah. I try not to get too into hard numbers. But the big thing is people that believe that the Greeks brought it into India. It's, if you look at where Babylon is, you look at where Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, northern India is, it's kind of not very coherent of a story that Greeks needed to bring it.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's just really removing that concept. India itself was one of the most literate cultures of the ancient world. And when I say India, notice Pakistan, Afghanistan were Sanskrit-based cultures previous to the Muslim invasions. And so the Sanskrit language had such a plethora of written material that has been destroyed in the last millennia.
Mm.
But yeah, otherwise, time is slightly irrelevant. But as long as there was astrology and the 12 sign zodiac, India was using it.
Yeah, I like it. I also like I'm going to sit with what you just said, that it's, if you were looking for, I'm just going to push the boat out, an uninterrupted continuity of what was going on in Babylon. It doesn't mean it's the same. It means it's uninterrupted. I like that. I like the idea that there is, in fact, the electricity still runs along those wires. That's really interesting. Which brings me to the next question about how lineages work and how you came to be in the one you were there. Because what I find really evocative about, again, I keep going to say Vedic astrological, I'm going to go into anyway, but you know what I mean. The Vedic astrological cosmovision is that it does look like where we find other living systems, where it's lineage based. So there are variations that are that happen when you're in a system that is run on lineages. So maybe talk to us about that.
So my teacher, his family, they trace themselves to the area of Gujarat, which is the northernmost part of India, right near the Pakistan border area, to a temple called the Somnath And that temple was destroyed and razed in the 800s. And his family has records of moving to central India, which was a very large university area at that particular time period. And the university area that they lived in was destroyed by Muslim invasions in the 11th century. And at that point in time, they stayed until the around the early 1500s, and then they were invited by the king of Puri, which um, was a kingdom on the east coast of India. And so the family moved there. They installed, there's a little tiny Somnath temple in the village that was founded because they were gifted land to create a village. And so there's a tracing of the family line in this way. And they came and they were the Raj Jyotishas of the king of Puri, meaning that they were counselors to the king. And my guru's grandfather was the last person in that role, because after independence, when the British were ruling India, they basically let the ancient kingdoms remain, and they just made it so that the kings ruled the people, and they just had to pay taxes to the British, and orchestrate everything that the British requested. After independence, India kind of stepped into a more modern world governance, and a lot of the kings lost most of their property and was confiscated, and it became a more socialization, or I don't know what the right word is, but that was the end of the kings and the royal astrologers and things of that nature. My teacher, so it was his grandfather. His grandfather taught to his uncle. His uncle didn't have any children that took on the tradition, so it was his nephew that took the tradition. And I met my teacher. So I had done my internship 1 year, and I met a handful of astrologers, and I had read everything that was available in English, and I was right on par with a lot of them. I could keep up and argue, or there was not much for them to teach. And so the next year I traveled India, really visiting a lot of astrologers. And finally there was, I came to meet my teacher, and I'd read some of his writings. There was an address and something that he had written. I went, knocked on his door. I had no clue that he was a big teacher. And he answered the door. He thought I was there for a consultation. And I said, no, I want to learn. And he started to ask me questions. And all of a sudden, it was the first time I felt stupid. It was the first time I was like, oh, I don't know that. No clue. Like I was, and I was realizing that I'd finally met somebody way bigger than anything that I had come across. And he was ready to send me to one of his students. And just at that moment, someone knocked at the door, and it was a woman who was coming for a consultation. And she came in. He opened up the chart for the moment, the horary chart for what was in the sky at the moment that this woman came. And he said, why is she here? And so I had to put my skills to the test. And I said, she's having problems with her children. And I was correct. And then he said, how many children does she have? And I said, one son and a daughter. And he said, yes, there's a son, but look, this is in exchange. And so it's not a daughter. That exchange is making it a son. And he literally started teaching me with that woman. And I just happened to come on a Sunday, and that's the day he taught classes. And so I got to sit in on class and was invited to come back. And that was my start with the tradition that I'm in. Is there more that you want? Like, I can talk different levels of the tradition as well. Um,
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear more. I'd love to. So, but just I wanted the timeline bit, which is they have
Yeah.
records that go back. What is that now? 1,200 years from a different part. But that's just, again, it's the sort of beginning of the records. But it's a sort of it's a lineage contained or kept in custodianship by a particular family line that goes back 1,200 years. Is that common's the wrong word? Is that how Vedic astrology moves through time? Is it lineage based as a typical thing?
So the thing is, we have there are traditional lineages in India, and then there's modernized India. And modernized India, anybody can pick up a book at the local store, read some astrology, and just like in the West, say, I'm doing astrology and do anything. There are traditions, and in those traditions, they do not teach white people. They do not teach non-Brahmins. And it's very uncommon of the more traditional lineages to let a white person in. I was lucky enough, my teacher is he was brought up in that way, but then for his university, his father sent him to South India, and to where he's from, they wouldn't even teach a South Indian what they know because they're considered so different than their own lineage that they come from. And he's a much more open-minded individual. And he's like, these people aren't that much different than us. And this is one person from one part of India to another part of India. It's almost like somebody like from California saying somebody in Florida, oh, they're not that different. Everybody said they were all Hicks, and these people aren't that bad. And he was a very open-minded person that started teaching white people. And he's like, these people know astrology, they should know it too. And it's created a lot of issues with some of the elders in the tradition. And to the point where, yeah, I don't want to go too into the politics of that, but um, so there are traditional lineages. They are kept very tight, and it's not like anybody can just go to India and meet a traditional astrologer and say, hey, I want to learn your tradition.
And is it, this is again an oversimplification, but you'll know what I mean. One of the principal differences would be presumably the more embodied praxis that come along with like a family or tradition or lineage, right? So as you say, you can go and get the books, but you have less of the stuff that we'd call magic, or like, do you like the magical components in a Western understanding that go along with Vedic astrology are presumably individualized to lineages and also more apparent. Is that a fair statement or not?
Oh yeah, you can't get the magic from a book.
Nice one. Oh, this is a question that Austin suggested, but learning mantras from YouTube, harmless fun?
On a first level, most of the mantras that you get from YouTube, they won't work just because they're from YouTube, and the average person isn't going to pronounce them correctly, and they're not having that same power that's coming with them. When they are properly chosen based on the astrological significations in the chart, and they're given by somebody who's been empowered to give them, they have a different life that they're coming with. They're coming, it's almost a magical item that has not, if we, not looking at a mantra, we can take a magical item. A person has a wand. Is it a wand with powerful magic in it, or is it a stick? And so magical items are imbued with power. In the same way, words have the ability to be empowered, so that when they're given with a jiva, with a soul to them, with life force to them, to be able to have a greater impact.
I like it. That's cool. Just following up on that, and jiva and life force and magic. When was or do you have a particular exciting example of the first time you realized this sort of lineage you're studying in, when it all worked together? Do you know what I mean? Like spectacular magical results. We're talking about things like mantra, and again, we can kind of put brackets or quotation marks around the word magic. But
Yeah.
do you have stories about, or when did you kind of realize, like, wow, this stuff works spectacularly well and reliably?
The thing is, when you are in India, it's not considered, you don't see it as magical in the same way. Somebody's coming, they're not getting a job, they're given a mantra, they a month later they're like, oh, I got a new job, thank you so much. Or there's this dispute happening and some rituals done, and then the dispute's done away with, or somebody's in court battling over something, and so the special priest needs to be called from a particular temple to do a particular ritual, and then everything is good. It's almost, that's your day-to-day life as a traditional Vedic astrologer in India.
So no, like, parting of the seas or anything where you're like, wow, that old guy over there did some mantras and the seas parted. Like, was there a moment, because at some point you got to fall back on your
I mean, I still sometimes have moments where I'm amazed of how the universe works, and things. Just a recent example. I myself, I got a new farm in 2016, and I got the place. The neighbor came over, and he said, your well's still working. And I said, yeah, what do you mean? He said, it normally goes dry by July and August. And I was just like, whoa, that wasn't mentioned, you know.
yeah.
and and it was in a 3-year drought. So it was year 3 of a 3-year drought. And this well normally, like in a good year, goes dry July and August. And so maybe 2 weeks after the neighbor said that, the well all of a sudden went dry for about an hour. And then the next day it went dry for maybe 2 hours. And then and so I called up this one particular priest, and I said, and that wasn't something that I had dealt with before. So I called up this priest that I knew would be able to work with that. And I said, this is what's going on. And he asked me if there was any Vastu flaws. And I said, and Vastu is like Indian feng shui. And I said, there's one flaw to the place that I'm planning to fix later. And we organized for him to do a ritual. I got dirt from the northeast corner, sent it to him. I got plans to redo some of the shape of the structure that was on the property. And on the day he did the ritual, I redid the Vastu. I added a room onto the main structure on the property. And the next day we had plenty of water, and we had, because my wife is a permaculturist, and we had a huge garden. It gave us water for the rest of the season with no problem. Now, sometimes you can say, somebody comes they're looking to get married, and they're not getting married. You give them a mantra or a ritual to do, and then they meet somebody. And you can say they might have met somebody anyway, or somebody's trying to find a house or trying to sell their house, and you give them a ritual or a mantra, and then it sells. And you know, how can you prove it was the mantra and it wouldn't have happened anyway? But in you know, on year 3 of a drought, a well that normally goes dry in the middle of the summer, all of a sudden working the whole year in excess of what it's ever worked.
Yeah. So what you're saying is you had some experience with farms and water before my farm almost burned down 2 years later.
I remember. And,
yeah. That was a Vasuki mantra. And it's funny when you say, how can you tell? Because I've just finished up having part of that adventure in the book that I've almost finished. And we obviously had that elected, and I'll get you to tell your side of that story in a minute. But when the rain actually showed up several days later, it was the first time the moon was in Pisces, which was the next watery time for the results to show up, and sort of being here we needed 25 mils of rain, 35 mils of rain rather, to put out the fire, and we got 36. So it showed up at the first available water time, and it was the exact right amount, and the farm didn't burn down. So it's like, when you say, well, would that have happened anyway? I don't care.
No, it wouldn't have happened. It came from nowhere. And and I remember that when that happened, and I talked to Austin, and you guys were thinking of doing a ritual at the same planetary hour in the different time zones. And from the Indian perspective, we wouldn't want to do that, because the time zone that matters is only the time at the place of what we have in the rituals. Is there's a karta, meaning the person who's doing the ritual. And we take a primary officiant of the ritual, and it's their time that matters. And so as long as it's their time is good, then we get everybody in the rest of the world to do it at their time to support the energy going through that person.
Yeah, well, it definitely worked, and it was a really interesting experience at the time, because the membership has already had some considerable experience with geographically distributed rituals via the internet and so on. But being at the epicenter of that, obviously it was a dramatic setting anyway. We had to drive back into the valley as roads were opening and closing and whatever, to get to the farm. So that part was dramatic enough. But yeah, it was very interesting it felt like being at the epicenter of it in a highly unusual way. But I don't know if you heard the coda to the story a week or so later, because Austin and I were working out how to pay Vasuki back, and we were looking for water charities, and I ended up strewing like semi-precious stones in the river that runs along the front of my property and so on. And I did that, and within 24 hours, it was the next day, but I did that on an evening. The Bureau of Meteorology put out a tweet that shows this kind of great curving cloud dragon the whole way around Tasmania, with an open mouth kind of coming back in from the southwest to my little corner in the southeast. And I'm like, well, I guess that went well, because you don't want to upset a dragon who just went to the effort of saving your farm, right?
And just to go into why, because Austin was consulting me. He's like, we need to bring wind, rain. We're thinking this or this. And I said, let's do this form, this Naga form. And I got that teaching because I'm in India studying. And then, when you're in India studying, you take little trips. And when I take little trips, I'll take a day trip to go meet this guy who's a famous forehead reader, who can tell everything just by looking at your forehead. And another day I'll take a trip, another weekend, to a place where they have some magic pot that whatever comes out of it has this medicine, all these kind of magical realms. And at one point I went up into Sikkim. There was and so I call him a tantric. And now the term tantric in the West has kind of taken on a sexual connotation. In India, the term tantric has a very magic practitioner connotation. Traditionally, it didn't mean that. Traditionally, it meant a certain type of ritual. But because the tantrics texts are filled with spells to make a person fall in love with you, or spells to heal a disease, the people who are doing these more magical practices are termed tantrics. And I went and spent a month with an individual who he had the ability to control the weather. And, he'd want to take a walk. He would do something. It could be raining outside. He would go out, hold his stick up, do some things. It would stop raining. He would take his walk, come back and hold up his stick, and it would start raining again. And so and through him I learned about the powers of the elemental nagas to really work with the weather. And so that's where that mantra was coming from.
Mm. It, if I hadn't known any of that, or the form that Vasuki shows up in, and what have you, when the rain arrived in time, I still would have said, which is quite counterintuitive from a Western perspective when you're dealing with fires, which you typically associate with dragons, right? When the clouds arrived, I'm surprised people in the town didn't duck. It was a dragon. I don't know what else to say. Like you couldn't see it because the clouds were there, pouring rain down on the fire. But it was this sort of, and it was, the experience of it was this languid, not slow moving, but just moving at with the confidence that this is what happens now, and that nothing could stop it. And so it wasn't violent. It wasn't racing to the rescue. It wasn't battling a fire or anything. It was just there. And it was a sort of a correction to the universe. Like it was just, this is the rain because it was previously out of balance. It was just the most extraordinary, I want to use grimoire terms for it. I want to say things like physical appearance. Like it was a dragon. You could, if you pointed up, if I just asked one of the local townsfolk, like, what's in those clouds, they would say, a dragon? I don't know. It was incredible.
One thing that would be nice to do also to commemorate that is installing a large stone as a sacred place for making Vasuki offerings and pouring water over that once a month or yearly to commemorate that time. But having done that and put that into the space, that's a blessing that you can create a space that will hold that and contain that and keep that energy present in the environment.
Is there any, you were talking about directions and permaculture and so on before, where on the property would be the best place to put that?
I would put it towards the north.
Cool.
You have a few potentials, but yeah.
Well, so the river runs, the house sort of broadly faces northwest anyway. And so the river's at the front of the property. So where I actually made the semi-precious stone offering was in fact in the north, because that's how I get down to the river anyway. So that's good. I'll put it.
you can do in the north for that particular form. Also the biggest tree on the property, or a very special water feature on the property. So putting it by the river would also be beautiful.
Nice. All right. I will definitely do that, because it has actually, we did commemorate it because it's only been, well, it's still February. So yeah. It was a year, it was only it was a year and 3 or 4 days ago that the whole, 2 years and 3 or 4 days ago that the whole adventure packed itself up. It doesn't feel like 2020 happened. I keep counting, going like 2019 was last year. Because
but by having a large stone or something where that's offered to hold the space of that, it becomes a place where people can come and connect to the energy that was called forth at that time, and then have a deeper, more powerful relationship to water in and of itself.
Yeah, I'm into it. It's also where we pull water from the river to irrigate the orchard and so on. So maybe I'll also name my generator Vasuki. I actually had
so to me, these kind of things, it's every day, every week. There's something of that somebody will email me or I talk to with a client who's coming for a second time. When I was in India, these are in the tradition, the more traditional realm. These are just, it's like that's the way it is.
Yeah, it's like you take aspirin and you have temporary pain relief. It's like that's the sequence of events. You have an intervention and then the thing happens.
Yes.
I like it. All right. Speaking of, I want to circle back because I think this is kind of interesting, and it might touch somewhat on what you were talking about, the variations in density. But who, which, looking at the sort of Hellenistic level, did anything come from the Eastern Mediterranean into India? Like, which bits went east and which bits went west, if any at all? And bearing in mind that yours would be certainly an educated guess, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of there's not a lot of evidence. It's sort of it is my educated guess is that probably, because certainly since Alexandria, right, there was contact between the two, and so it is my understanding.
Way before.
Yeah, sure, of course.
3000 BC. They were trading beads from northern India and Sumeria. And literally there's archaeological records of vials of perfume and beads that are in Sumerian tombs that are from India. So 3000 BC, there was trade going back and forth between northern India and Sumeria. And approximately similar time period, we have trade between Egypt and various cities and in Africa with South India. If you think about the time of Jesus, his one disciple Thomas went to South India because there was a Jewish colony in South India at the time of Jesus, because it was a trading center. And so there has been, to me, it's a back and forth over an extended time period. If we look at what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, that was in the 800s when they were invaded and with the Muslim invasions. That area was about 80% Buddhist. If we take that back another 1,000 years, we get into the realm of these, they call them Greco-Hindu kingdoms, and we find Zeus temples in that part of India. I think a lot of temple culture came from, and people say from Greece. I think Greece got its temple culture from Egypt. And so via Egypt, through Greece, and via Egypt through South India, India got a lot of its temple culture, a lot of its architectural, its ritual architectural elements. If we look at the Vedic culture, it was a very mathematical culture. You talked about the number of bricks. There was, and this is where, in Indologists' absurdity comes in. There was one Indologist who said they learned trigonometry to be able to make their ritual platforms. Who would learn trigonometry for ritual? They were learning spherical trigonometry, and they were putting the numbers that correlated to that into how many bricks and where the bricks were laid in their rituals. Why did they have spherical trigonometry? They would only have that because they were doing advanced math of observing the sky, calculating planetary motion, calculating sun-moon relationships for calendrical calculations. So to me, I think a lot of the mathematics and really root fundamentals of astrology is coming from this. And again, the Sumerian Vedic culture were interactive directly on a day-to-day basis. And so I think a lot of that early evolution was connected in that way. Then we have what we see in the clay tablets, and then all of a sudden we have this fully developed system of astrology in Egypt and Greece. And to me, this Hindu-Greek kingdom realm, there was a lot of reformation and clarification that came about in the present 12-sign system that we're using. If we look into some of the more ancient texts, they were using a 12-month overlaid with 27 star system, and there's tons of ritual and sound magic and everything of that nature associated with that. But um, it was an evolution, and to think that the Egypt, India, Babylonia were not connected, I think is a real mistake to make. And
Sure.
archaeologically very clear that they were not, even if philologically, we don't have any written texts connecting them.
That's an absence of evidence thing. It's sort of course you wouldn't. It doesn't mean it didn't happen.
But
I agree
it's an
completely.
but this is the thing, it's not an absence of evidence, it's an absence of written books. Archaeologically, there's evidence that they were all interacting before Greece even became a major civilization.
Yeah, totally. But inarguably, in the what we would call the Hellenistic era, we got in the West a synthesis that is sort of 80% of what would define astrology in the West for the subsequent 1500 years, right? And as you say, like, because there are bits that have been pulling in from dynastic Egypt from there, and this is why I asked, like, how old is Vedic astrology and which are the oldest bits? Because I think that high level mathematics is one of those 20,000 year time depth things, because it's present across everywhere we find stuff that's broadly similar and interactive, right? And I think that's an exercise in harmonics. I think that's why you have sacred sounds and ratios and so on. What they're doing is a Stone Age sacred science, right? Like, so I actually think some of the earliest parts are, if anything, the most complex, and it has a systematization that comes down into things like the 12 signs that you just described. So, but was there? Do you think? Was there anything noticeable that goes into the? It's not even Hellenistic astrology solidified, but into the seeming coherence of those couple of centuries that were ported around that time, do you think? Like, is there evidence somewhere like India that, again, this is the guess bit. When I say evidence, I mean, like, do you think they got lunar mansions then? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you think it was
Well, they had lunar mansions 3000 BC.
Sure.
There's hard references to the names of those stars. Or however old somebody wants to date the Vedas themselves, 3000 BC is a little bit older than in the Oxford, and a little bit earlier than people that say 20,000 years. To me, I think if we get too focused on the date, we actually lose something. To me, the most important thing is realizing that it was a team effort of these ancient civilizations, and kind of like we had cell phones. Slowly everywhere in the world had cell phones. Then all of a sudden we had smartphones. Everywhere in the world had smartphones. I think it's a mistake to think that these major civilizations in the ancient world, and I won't say I think, there were representatives in the court of Alexandria from northern India, because that was a particular kingdom, and from southern India, both in the court of Alexandria, from records that we know. So there was direct connections happening all the time. And as this system evolved, it was shared in various ways. And there's the human element of its evolution. And I'll tell a little story about the copper plates, we call them, the Tamara Patra of my tradition. And it kind of brings in a different element. So the present spiritual lineage of my tradition, and there's the astrological element, and then there's the spiritual element. There was a spiritual saint in the 1500s in Odisha, and this part of India that the tradition comes from. And he was a genius who had special powers and yogic abilities, and He was an astrologer, healer, everything of that nature. And when he passed, he left these 3 books. And when I say books, they're the Indian palm leaf style books. But instead of palm leaves, they were made out of these thin sheets. One was made out of thin sheets of copper, one thin sheets of silver, one thin sheets of gold. And think of about a book that instead of it being wooden paper, it's these thin sheets of metal as pages. And in the Gadi, the center that I've been studied, that I studied and worked with the most, they have the copper plates. And these copper plates are completely, there's nothing written on them. And they shut the book, and you can put your hand on it, think a question or questions, and they open this book, and there's engraved in the copper, as if somebody like literally engraved into it, it says what your question was, and then it gives you the answer. And you shut the book, and if you open it again, there's nothing on the pages. And when the answers are in this book, these answers are from the 1500s lineage, spiritual lineage holder. Like he's talking, he's writing. You know, his power is coming through the times to still guide. So in different time periods where I had doubts or confusions, and I'm teaching and I have students, and should I do this or should I do that? I could, when I was in India, go and ask, and he would give me counsel. And he would speak in this 15th century Odia, which is the language that he spoke. And it would be written there, and we'd have to translate it. But the silver plates speak in whatever language the person is coming to question is in, but the copper plates only in the one way. And so we have this device, or whatever you want to call it, the power, the magic of these books, and that they can not only give you answers, but they tell you what the question is that you're getting an answer to. And when we think about the evolution of astrology, we have to remember that there's magic involved. And there's the science of being able to see where the stars are and what's happening when, but there's other elements that that if we just focus too much on time and when, there's other forces at play.
Is this back to the density thing? Do you know what I mean?
Back to the, and over there, that's normal. You know, yeah. the local politicians, the mayor is confused about, there's 2 options of how to redo the road. So they go to the copper plate, and the copper plate says, the road, this ritual needs to be done to make this deity happy. Then we can move that temple, and then the road can be done as per whatever. Like, reality is working at that level over there. And over here, that sounds like crazy magic. Sometimes people don't even believe me that, like, sure, over there, that's normal. I can talk, and that's that's the Gadi, the center for my lineage. I can talk about, there's a handful of lineages, and they have their own, whether it's copper plates or various divinatory devices that work very similarly.
Oh, yeah. You won't have a problem with belief or disbelief amongst this audience, that's for sure. It's something Ernesto Di Martino said in the 20th century, but cultures that believe in magic get better magical results, more or less. So that's a sort of field and density question as well. You will get similar things in Peru or Brazil or somewhere where it is. Yeah, again, it's like what you were talking about, the density of being elsewhere but the West, I suppose.
Yeah, the density. And I even feel it seeping into my head when I'm in the West for too long. I can feel my consciousness getting more dense and less enlivened by what we would call here these magical realms, where when I'm there, I'm in it. There's no doubting it. There's no thinking about it. You're just in it, living it, and seeing the magic and how it works. And it's everybody in the village goes together, and it's not like this is something I'm doing, and it's not that I'm the only one doing it and everybody else isn't. Everybody does it. If we don't do this, it won't rain. Let's go do this. And yeah.
Yeah, I love
So
it. Yeah, I love it. So what do you do? What are your
yeah.
So what do you do now that you're still stuck in the West for a bit? Is there, I presumably there's mantra stuff, because I know what you mean. Like a big part of my magical development, particularly in my time in Europe, but generally for my life, is to go to places where, a weird way of saying, I mean this poetically, where magic is real, where you can't but not feel it, and there's something about regular contact with it that it gets into your bones. And I think it makes you a better practitioner whether you're there or not, because you're either you either take it away with you because it's soaked in, or it's just so you understand on a profound level that this is the way the universe operates. So it's easier to operate with it.
And and I say that, and I'm surrounded by a group of practitioners that do puja once or twice a week, and we have our big Ganesh rituals and all the holiday rituals. I have where I live, one of the a very powerful Vedic priest moved from where I was studying in India to the local area that I live. And so he runs all the local rituals for our community, and does the various remedial measures for my students and occasionally people that are not too far away, um, because not all priests are equal, and some priests are better than others, just in any realm. And he's really a powerful priest who's able to get good results. So I'm in it, but it's the larger density of the country itself.
Yeah.
And so it's more work. It's more work to enter those realms and to stay in those realms and of that nature.
That's a good way of thinking about it. That's a good way of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Freedom, this has been, I knew it would be a fantastic chat. It's clarified some things for me, and having to and to be able to weave it into the story of what it is you have done and are doing. So thank you very much for that. For
Yes.
people for people who want to know more, tell them, where they can find you and your books and what you got going on and all that kind of stuff.
So I have two books presently. Both are called Science of Light, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And that's my introduction to Jyotish, to what is called Vedic Astrology. And I teach a year-long course for each book. We're just starting a level 1 right now. I start once a year. And a lot of my students are practicing, and I really gear to teach to get people practicing, not as a hobby. To me, practicing it really makes it come alive. I I would say that I do consultations, but I'm booked out over a year right now. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to, because I have a waiting list that people can go on, but I don't know if that waiting list will ever. Yeah, I don't know how that waiting list is going to unfold, but if people want to study with me, they are 100% welcome. And I have various articles online, and I like to. I'm a writer as well, so I put various articles here and there, and blog posts and things of that nature. I also have a YouTube. I have two YouTube channels. One that's when I go to conferences and give lectures, I put on one YouTube channel, and then in 2005, 6, and 7, I had just I was alive with the tradition. My teacher was telling me you need to be teaching, and I was just teaching from the living room of my home at that time. And all those recordings are available on YouTube. These days, the teachings are a little bit more organized, and I'm guiding people through it, but there's tons of audios and videos and written material out there if anybody wants to read more and connect.
Nice one. So this will all be in the show notes, but the URLs for the websites?
The class website is scienceoflight.net. And my personal website is Shri, S-H-R-I, Shri Freedom. I think it's .org. And from that, you can get to the blogs and YouTubes and everything of that
Awesome.
nature.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, sir. An amazing chat. Really, really cool stuff. And yeah. And thanks for helping save my farm. I mean, I should probably throw that in there somewhere too.
I'm glad you were able to harness it and bring it in and make it happen. And that blessing of Vasuki. Now there's a place that one day will build up and be a Vasuki temple on your land if it's honored and kept up. So
Yeah, count on it.
I'm happy I was able to help.